Hello and welcome, everybody out there in Megland and anybody else who has dropped in to see what we're on about. It's been a while since we've done a podcast about Meg, about anything. But whilst we were at BritCon back in August, we were asked by some people about whether we were going to do any more. When I say we, Matt and Richard were asked whether we were going to do any. I don't remember being asked about it. So obviously I'm in totally surplus requirement on this. And Matt and Richard provide all the entertainment and information that everybody wants. So, or maybe you're just sick of hearing me waffling on. So anyway, we decided we'd come and do some more podcasts for you, and we enjoy doing them. So it's a bit of self-interest there as well. It's a bit later than we'd originally planned on doing this one. Real life has got in the way, but hopefully be worth it. So anyway, we have the usual team: is myself, Matt Haywood, and Richard Jeffrey Cook. Hi guys.
Hi there.
So welcome back, and thank you for rejoining on this. So. Tonight's topic is one, again, Richard has volunteered a topic. I mean, what would we do without him? You'd probably just hear Matt and I talking about our latest plans for Matt 3D printing me new armies and him printing new armies. And I believe you're printing your brother the entire Confederation of the Rhine or something for Napoleonics, aren't you, Matt, as an ongoing lifelong project?
Pretty much at a 1-to-1 scale, I think.
Yeah. so I'm sure you all don't want to hear about that. So, and as I'm sure you all know, there's been a set of proposed competition amendments which are currently up for and out for discussion. If you haven't seen them, surprised for a start, but they're out on the forum anyway. But anyway, Richard's topic is linked to part of those changes, so making it doubly topical. And he volunteered to talk about hoplite warfare. Now, I think, right, Richard, it's more about hoplites versus non-hoplites.
Indeed, that is the task I set myself.
so I must admit, my knowledge of hoplite warfare is not great. My historical interests lie elsewhere. So as ever, I'm really looking forward to what Richard is going to talk to us about. And then no doubt we will discuss various bits and pieces and how this might impact and where it led on to some of those proposed changes. So anyway, hoplites are probably one of the archetypes of good infantry in the ancient world. Some very famous examples, of course. Spartans, obviously, Theban Sacred Band, all those sort of guys. So anyway, I'm going to shut up as usual, since I was not asked about podcast, and I'm going to sulk about that for minutes. I'll go over to obviously one of the more popular pair of other podcasters. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. So tonight we're looking at hoplites and particularly their clashes against non-hoplites. When I started looking at this, I imagined that there might be some readily available information out there, but the more I looked at it, the more it seems to be a topic that hasn't particularly been discussed, at least in more popular history books. Let's put it like that. I don't know about academic research, although from what I could find hunting around, there didn't seem to be a lot specifically about it on academic research. There's an awful lot about hoplite versus hoplite warfare, but much less, it seems to me, about the other opponents they faced and how they adapted to that. So, brief introduction. Hoplites were the backbone of Greek state armies from around the 7th century, probably mid-7th century, late 7th century, through to the end of the 4th century BCE, if I've got my dates right. I mean, they survive occasionally a bit later than that, but that is really the height of the period of hoplite warfare. The key aspects, I suppose, of hoplite warfare is the shield, the hoplon, as it's referred to in Greece, which seems to give hoplites their name. Although another Greek word for shield is aspis, so you have to be slightly careful with Greek and the understanding of the meanings here. But the hoplite shield in particular is significant, combined with the spear that the hoplites used and the fact that they formed up definitely in what we refer to as a phalanx. So fighting as a group rather than as individuals. The shield in particular is quite interesting. It's generally 75 to 90 centimetres across, I believe. And the shape seems to be quite important as well. There is a suggestion that the sort of rounded shape of the hoplite shield actually can be pushed into the back of the person in front of you without suffocating them, which, as you may be aware, when you get mobs of people crushed together, suffocation is a big danger, and people get crushed and can't breathe, and most deaths are actually caused by asphyxiation. But the suggestion is that the shape of the hoplite shield mitigates against this to some degree. Now, this is still being controversially debated between various academics, and there seems to be some suggestion it's going a bit back the other way. But it also does combine with the idea that hoplite warfare could be a case of sort of a bit like the rugby scrum of pushing against each other. Although this is, as I say, is very debated. However, I mean, more information about hoplite panoply and the use of the spears and so on, it's probably best discussed in detail in Christopher Matthews' book, A Storm of Spears. And I suspect Nick will be posting up a link to various books on hoplite warfare when this podcast is released.
Yep, I've got a list and I'm just double checking that Storm of Spears is on it.
I believe it is.
Excellent.
What I did was I started looking around for accounts of battles where hoplites weren't fighting hoplites. And one of the earliest, I suppose, and perhaps most famous, is actually a Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, which is described by Herodotus, 7 to 11.3, if you want the particular passage, which you can look up on Perseus or other websites. And he describes the conflict. Particularly interesting is the use of the Spartans using a feigned flight tactic, retreating and then swiftly turning back when the enemy broke ranks to pursue. If I read the 19th century translation, it says the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans in other words, meanwhile were fighting in a memorable fashion, and besides other things of which they made display, being men perfectly skilled in fighting opposed to men who were unskilled, they would turn their backs to the enemy and make a pretence of taking to flight. And the barbarians, seeing them thus taking a flight, would follow after them with shouting and clashing of arms. Then the Lacedaemonians would, when they were being caught up, turned and faced the barbarians, and thus turning round they would slay innumerable multitudes of the Persians. And there fell also at these times a few of the Spartans themselves. So it seems that it was a slightly risky tactic, but it sort of turns our head a bit on the idea of a sort of formed phalanx being a rigid formation with shields overlapped and spears in a long line thrusting. So the Spartans anyway, and I suspect you needed to be pretty well trained to pull this sort of manoeuvre off, certainly were capable of much more than that.
You'd have to be pretty confident.
Yeah, but I think the Spartans probably were.
I think on the whole, the Spartans did manage that. I was just going to interject a little bit on that one to say, I suppose if the formation isn't necessarily as rigid as we might imagine, that would help. Because a really closed up shield wall with a shield that's the best part of a metre across, that'd take some doing.
Absolutely. Anyway, I mean, one interesting question is how Herodotus actually heard about this. But this did occur before the bulk of the Greek army had actually retreated. So it is perfectly possible there were witnesses to what went on here. But it does still raise the question. Anyway, that's the account of hoplites fighting at Thermopylae. The next encounter was the following year at Plataea, and this is actually again described by Herodotus in book 962. And here he says, they, referring to the Spartans, could get no favourable omen for their sacrifices, and in the meanwhile many of them were killed and by far more wounded, for the Persians set up their shields for offence and shot showers of arrows. Now at this time Pausanias is supposedly waiting for the omens to be favourable. I have a sneaking suspicion that he was actually waiting for the right moment to attack, and maybe the situational position wasn't quite right at that point, but call me a cynic. Anyway, he then goes on. While he was still in the act of praying, the men of Tegea leapt out before the rest and charged the barbarians. And immediately after Pausanias' prayer, the sacrifices of the Lacedaemonians became favourable. Well, that was fortunate, wasn't it?
What a coincidence.
Now they too charged the Persians, and the Persians met them, throwing away their bows. First they fought by the fence of shields, and when that was down, there was a fierce and long fight around the temple of Demeter itself, until they came to blows at close quarters. Now I'm a bit confused by this, because it seems to suggest there was a fight in one place and then there was another fight near the temple, and only after that did they come to blows. But one imagines that if the Persians had already thrown away their bows, any fighting would have been at close quarters anyway. So it's all a bit confusing, it seems to me. And then he goes on, for the barbarians laid hold of the spears and broke them short. This does not seem to be a good way to achieve a long life, grabbing the enemy's spear and trying to break it. Now the Persians were neither less valorous nor weaker, but they had no armour. Moreover, since they were unskilled and no match for their adversaries in craft, they would rush out singly and in tens or in groups great or small, hurling themselves on the Spartans and so perishing. I'm a bit sceptical about this. This all sounds very dramatic, but I'm of the opinion that Herodotus is actually giving a big bit of storytelling here, and it's probably not exactly how a fight would actually occur. But he goes on, so long as Mardonius was alive, the Persians stood their ground and defended themselves, overthrowing many Lacedaemonians. For what harmed them most was the fact that they wore no armour over their clothes and fought, as it were, naked against men fully armed. Now, I suspect Herodotus is slightly overdoing the armour bit, but certainly compared to a Greek hoplite in full panoply, a Persian was pretty much limited, very limited in terms of their armour, and certainly probably didn't carry any significant shields, because they used the wicker fence carried by the spear bearer as their primary defence. So that's two examples of the hoplites fighting against the Persians. Moving on, perhaps, I then looked at when the hoplites had to fight lighter equipped troops, and most notably, of course, is the fight with the peltasts at Sphacteria, which is actually described in Thucydides's book 4, chapter 33.2. And he goes on to say, however, they, and again we're talking with the Spartans, were not able to engage or to profit by their superior skill, the light troops keeping them in check on either side with their missiles, and the heavy infantry remaining stationary instead of advancing to meet them. And although they routed the light troops wherever they ran up and approached too closely, yet they retreated fighting, being lightly equipped and easily getting the start in their flight. From the difficult and rugged nature of the ground in an island hitherto desert, over which the Lacedaemonians could not pursue them with their heavy armour. So, I mean, this is an example where obviously if the troops are light enough and have room to run away, which may have been one of the problems with the Persians at Thermopylae, for example, that they couldn't actually get moved backwards because of the press of all the troops behind them, that the hoplites were in trouble. But it is particularly worth noting that the Athenians still had their body of hoplites, which were sort of pinning the Spartans. Presumably the Spartans couldn't go just chasing off after all these peltasts, because if they did, they would have fallen victim to the Athenian hoplites. So it was the combination of lighter troops and the hoplites that inflicted the victory. And in fact, during the conflict, actually 128 out of the 420 Spartan hoplites at Sphacteria were actually killed, which is about nearly 30%. The rest surrendering. Yeah, I mean, it's clear that if the peltasts hadn't been there, the Spartans certainly believed that they had a good chance of beating the Athenian hoplites. Moving on in history, we then come to another example, which is the Battle of Cunaxa, described by Xenophon in his Anabasis. So the 10,000 have been recruited by Cyrus to overthrow his brother Artaxerxes, marches down all the way down the Euphrates till not that far from Babylon, I believe. And at the village of Cunaxa, they encounter the royal army of Artaxerxes. Get rather surprised, actually. They weren't ready for the battle, so they quickly have to deploy. And by apparently pre-arranged plan, the 10,000 are actually on the right flank of Cyrus's army, next to the river, whereas the rest of Cyrus's army is actually in the centre and left, facing the bulk of Artaxerxes' army. The 10,000 themselves along with their peltasts, actually faced a small body of Persian cavalry under Tissaphernes. These cavalry apparently charged through the peltasts, who may have taken some cover in some either fields or denser terrain by the river, and actually go on to sack or meet up with Artaxerxes at the Persian camp. But the 10,000 themselves are actually facing Egyptian, what are described as hoplites, but we're not 100% sure how Xenophon knew they were Egyptian hoplites, although presumably Greeks were familiar with Egyptians. Greek mercenaries had fought in Egypt, certainly. And in fact, the Egyptian hoplites were probably equipped with shields which actually went down to the ground. And this style of shield not only was used by the Egyptians, but also may have been used by others, such as the Assyrians. So we probably have may well have had a mixture of troops there. Anyway, they were also supported by what Xenophon describes as garapheroi, which is a term which means a bearer of a wicker shield. So that could probably be the troops armed with some sort of shortish spear or possibly a bow. Xenophon certainly doesn't say. Either way, the battle between the 10,000 and these troops was brief. At one point, Xenophon says they fled without fighting at all. In another section, it actually implies that there was some sort of brief fight. But either way, it wasn't much of a fight and they very quickly ran away. So this is an example where the Greek hoplites were certainly more capable than the troops that they were up against. There are actually a number of descriptions in the Anabasis of the 10,000 fighting other troops. Either some of the hill tribes which the 10,000 encountered en route, or indeed the Persians themselves earlier in the conflict. And they had particular trouble at first from the Persian cavalry. And they were beginning to suffer a bit, and it was demoralizing the Greeks. And then Xenophon, in a bit of sort of self-praise, I suspect, says Xenophon consequently decided that they must pursue the Persians, and this they did with such of the hoplites and peltasts as were guarding the rear with him. But in their pursuit they failed to catch a single man of the enemy, for the Greeks had no horsemen, and their foot soldiers were not able to overtake the enemy foot soldiers, since the latter had a long start in their flight. Within a short distance and a long pursuit far away from the main Greek army was not possible. Again, the barbarian horsemen, even when they were in flight, would inflict wounds by shooting behind them from their horses. And whatever distance the Greeks might at any time cover from in their pursuit, all that distance they were obliged to fall back fighting. So it's interesting that the horsemen in flight inflict wounds, but they don't actually seem to do more damage than that. And that seems to be fairly consistent with horse archers, in that they often seem to be able to inflict wounds, but it seems pretty rare or unusual for them to cause an outright kill. Obviously, if you're an infantryman stuck a long way from anywhere else, potentially getting surrounded by cavalry, wounds are still a serious problem. So should not be underestimated.
Arrow through the leg.
Yeah.
Could be.
I won't go on with the text in too much length, but the counter tactic, it was to actually recruit slingers, notably Rhodians, but also a few others of the Greeks who had experience in use of the sling. It is interesting to note that the Cretan bowmen and the javelin men that accompanied the 10,000, they weren't up to the job by themselves of seeing off the horsemen, and it needed slingers as well. Now, the bowmen obviously you'd have thought would have had the range, certainly capable of matching a mounted bowman anyway. My suspicion was actually the problem with the bowmen had was shortage of ammunition. If you shot all your arrows off at the horsemen, who then promptly fled, you didn't then have much opportunity to go and retrieve your arrows. And I would imagine, although I can't say for sure, that an arrow shot from a composite bow by a horse archer might not have been a lot of use to a cretin bowman. So you couldn't just pluck the arrows that had been shot by the enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
arrows
yeah,
tend to be
arrows
fairly specific.
They do tend to be a bit matched to bows, and they're probably something in that. You could probably shoot them, but not necessarily very effectively, I suppose.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think that is a thing.
Yeah. So anyway, I suspect the advantage of slingers was that potentially you could find a lot of ammunition en route, riverbeds
Pick
and
it
the
up
like.
off the ground.
Yeah, which may not be ideal. I mean, a purpose-built lead slingshot was supposed to be far more effective, but still was probably more than capable of seeing off some horsemen. Anyway, so another interesting description of the interaction between hoplites and other troops. My last couple of examples are actually from the Macedonian campaigns. So the first is the description of Chaeronea, which is Diodorus or Diodorus, however you pronounce him, book 1686. Then Alexander, so Chaeronea is the battle between the Macedonians and the Athenians and Thebans. It's not described in any great detail, but the example often quoted in the battle is Alexander winning with the companions. But what Diodorus actually says is, then Alexander, his heart set on showing his father his prowess and yielding to none in the will to win, ably seconded by his men, first succeeded in rupturing the solid front of the enemy line, and striking down many, he bore heavily on the troops opposite him. As the same success was won by his companions, gaps in the front were constantly opened, corpses piled up until finally Alexander forced his way through the line and put his opponents to flight. Now, the interesting thing about that particular bit of text is it never explicitly says that Alexander or his companions were mounted. So this is possible that this is a fight on foot. But I mean, the verdict on that, I think, is we don't really know. But it's interesting that almost all the descriptions written by later authors seem to imply Alexander leading at the head of his companions on horseback and charging in. Whether that really was the case or not, I'll leave it to you to decide, basically.
Well, yes, it's. I suppose with that one, Richard, is that there's a temptation to do it because in the battles where Alexander was actually in command, he always led the companions.
Yeah.
So, push it back. But I suppose the companions at Chaeronea would have been Philip's more than his.
Well,
it depends what Philip gave him.
Indeed.
It's an interesting one, isn't it?
Or what by that time Alexander personally commanded.
Yes.
Indeed. Anyway, we'll move on to the later example of Alexander attacking Greek mercenary hoplites, which was at the Battle of Granicus. This is described by Arrian, book 1:16, by Plutarch in book 16, chapter 1, and by Diodorus again. The most detailed account is in Arrian, and he says he's already. This is a description after the cavalry have been beaten, and he says, leading. So he's talking about attacking the mercenary hoplites, and he says, leading the phalanx against these, and ordering the cavalry to fall upon them from all sides in the midst, he soon cut them up, so that none of them escaped, except such as might have concealed themselves among the dead bodies. Plutarch's account is pretty much similar. The only difference is Plutarch explicitly suggests that Alexander actually had a horse killed under him during this fight. Not Bucephalus, Oxhead, his famous horse, and Plutarch explicitly says that. Although, again, how reliable that information is, we can't be entirely sure. In Diodorus, the only difference is that his description explicitly implies it was the foot who engaged the hoplites rather than the cavalry. But again, it's interesting. Often descriptions of Granicus that I've seen sort of imply it was Alexander on horseback leading the companions against the Greek mercenaries that broke them. But the actual sources seem to imply that a phalanx played a key part in defeating the mercenary Greek hoplites. There I have hoped to have covered some interesting information about what the sources actually say about hoplites and when they fought others. The interesting thing is that undoubtedly over the period of the 5th century and into the 4th century, the idea of combined arms, of initially hoplites working with lighter troops, peltasts and singers, and then Macedonians particularly taking it further with a combination of cavalry, and then the evolution of the hoplite into the phalangite, which we won't be discussing now because that could take another 4 hours by itself.
There's also Iphicrates.
Introduces a big change. Well, that might be a topic for another podcast at another time.
Well volunteered, Richard.
Anyway, so we have. I think what it shows is that actually hoplites were sort of could be quite flexible, and perhaps more flexible than we sometimes think. But fundamentally, it is still a formation that relies on unity, and it's not a formation primarily where people are fighting as individuals.
Yeah, I think a bits I've read on it, there's some comments about the hoplite phalanx, which basically just talks about the skill is standing together and being cohesive rather than anything much more than that. It's not even particularly about individual weapon skill. I
don't know. I suspect weapon skill was what differentiated the best hoplites from the poorer hoplites, and I suspect you had a range of hoplites with various abilities in different armies across the Greek world.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't doubt tell you that it's just something stuck in my mind that sort of if you like, the basic skill for a hoplite phalanx was standing together.
I think that was the skill you had to learn more than anything else, undoubtedly.
Yeah, and then you layered on that.
Take it from there.
Yeah. Richard, that's been great. I've inevitably got a couple of things for you. What did strike me, that you're covering a period there of a few hundred years, with the hoplite being in that part of the world a very effective infantryman. Obviously almost infantryman of choice. You've got the vast amounts of Greek mercenaries hired by Persians at various points. But it did also strike me that, and this is just a vagary of evidence really, is that there's actually not that many data points. You've got the Persian Wars in Herodotus, and then there's sort of a big gap. Because obviously, I suppose in Greek history, the focus turns on to the Peloponnesian Wars, and there's all the data points there. And then you get some with Persians. But, it's, I don't know, maybe I'm just wishing for more, and therefore...
Well, I didn't cover and didn't really have a chance to go through the wars of the Greeks in Sicily against the Carthaginians. So I suspect there may be further information you could extract from there. I suspect what we don't have much reliable information on is the accounts of the Greeks against the Italians. Because really our reliable sources only start to appear when we reach the era of Pyrrhus and his wars against the Romans. I suspect, unless there's a little bit in the early histories of Rome with Campania, I suspect there isn't a great deal of descriptions there. The other source which I'm aware of but didn't again have time to cover was there are accounts of the Cyrenians or Cyrenians who fought the Libyans. And there is some information, some descriptions there. Although I don't think there's much detail in those from memory.
There's never enough detail.
The other area of Herodotus, I think, is there are some descriptions of the Greek fights in Egypt, supporting the various Egyptian revolts against the Persians. But again, time restricted me from doing this. But it would be interesting if there have been any academic studies focusing on hoplites fighting non-hoplites. Actually, one of those things, missed opportunity. I should have asked Duncan Head at the Society of Ancients Convention last week. If anybody was to know, I'm sure it would be Duncan. I might ask on the Society of Ancients forum, just as a
that sounds good. I mean, if nothing else, I would expect him to point in the direction of where you might find stuff like that. And just sort of related point to that was just wonder. I assume there, you started off with sort of Thermopylae, Plataea, and those wars. Is I take it there's not anything particularly material about the Ionian Revolt, because it strikes me that the Persians obviously suppressed the Ionian Revolt, presumably would have fought hoplites, because if I remember rightly, the Greek cities on that side did have hoplites. And so presumably by the time they got to Greece, and they'd possibly even be thinking, oh look, more of those guys we beat up in Ionia.
There is brief accounts, I seem to remember, of the Ionian Revolt, which I presume must be Herodotus. unless it's somewhere else. But um, I mean, the Persians certainly had experience of fighting Greeks even before Marathon, of course, which was
Marathon, yeah.
which as a battle is very problematic, and has various different academic opinions of A, where it is fought, and B, actually who was responsible for the Greek victory. There's a book fairly recently which sort of made the claim that it was the light troops in the centre with two hoplite wings, and it was the light troops in the centre who routed the Persian cavalry, which always seemed a bit likely to me, because why would some Persian cavalry bother to fight mere Greek light troops? But there you go.
It is, yeah. So there's one last thing that goes back to Plataea, actually. The descriptions you gave from Herodotus, which are interesting. It's presumably the Spartans there were fighting some reasonably good Persian troops, because it sounded to me from what you said that although they won, and thanks to their equipment and all that, it wasn't an easy fight.
No, and indeed, I mean, the best of troops Mardonius had was the immortals that Xerxes left behind. Darius? Was it, no.
God, which order they come in, is it?
I'm gone blank now. But anyway,
you just say the Persian king.
Yeah, Persian king left behind. But anyway, yes, I mean and it seems reasonable to assume that the troops left behind with Mardonius were actually amongst the best of the Persian army, because why would you leave behind the big massive levy that they initially brought with them? Yes, and Mardonius himself was actually well versed in fighting the Greeks, because he was experienced at trap.
Right.
There are other odd accounts. I mean, Xenophon's Hellenica talks about Agesilaus, the Spartan king who fought in Asia. So there are descriptions of that, although I couldn't find one that was particularly pertinent to the topic in my brief run through.
Time, that finite resource. And the amount of time you can spend going through a whole book to find the one line that might give you some vague information.
Four books I have referred to come up with today's topic.
Yeah. So, Matt, any thoughts?
A couple of things occurred to me a bit randomly. Was what were the Greek Navy using as their Marines? I only ask because, like, Roman Marines are essentially auxiliary or legionaries, and presumably did the Greeks use hoplite equivalents but without the panoplies, because that gives you an idea of how they fought?
Certainly in the Persian Wars, in Persian invasion of Greece, I believe the triremes were typically equipped with 4 hoplites and another 16 or so bow or javelin light troops. I believe that's off the top of my head, and apologies if I've got that wrong. You don't have many Marines. It was still primarily a ramming contest in those days. When you get to the later era of the successors, then I think the assumption is the Marines were typically armed with javelins, so you could take your land forces. Macedonian phalangites were often, or specific Usonoi were equipped to fight lighter battles, and those were what you would use as Marines. But they had substantially larger crews of Marines, and actions were often as much boarding actions rather than ramming actions.
Interesting. And the other, the other thought I had was, given that the hoplite for their period in history tends to be the primary heavy foot, it seems odd that, well, the Persians didn't adopt it themselves. They didn't seem to. They relied on mercenary hoplites, or they relied on Ionian subjects to provide their own hoplite equivalents. It just seems.
I think in part that is that can be explained by culture and equipment. So if you're talking about the further east of the Persian Empire, then you're looking at areas which weren't particularly suited to hoplite warfare. So the Iranian plateau, or areas further east are not really natural hoplite territory, it may be assumed. And I think, in fact, I suspect part of the problem the Persians had in conquering and holding on to Egypt was the Egyptians themselves had a tradition of fighting with formations of heavy spearmen, maybe not as heavy as the Greek hoplites, but still. And the Persians didn't have any sort of native troops. Persia was an empire of other nations, and they didn't really have any native troops they could train up as hoplites to the same degree. I mean, I think it's the Kardakas, is it? Who are, or is it Takabara? I always get the two confused. Who are imitation hoplites, who seem to be Persians trained as hoplites, but they only appear in the 4th century, really.
I think it's the Kardakas.
Kardakas.
Yeah. I think mind you, they're another we don't really know troop type, aren't they?
Well, yes, that's a sort of best guess, but there is certainly evidence that the Persians themselves did try to adopt hoplite panoply with some of their later troops, and not always terribly successfully. If you could hire Greeks, I mean, the one thing the Persians weren't short of was plenty of cash, and it was probably a lot easier to hire rebellious Greeks than it was to try and train your own peasant levies.
Yes.
And if you're a noble Persian, of course, you want to fight on horseback. You don't want to.
Yes.
What do you call a Persian on foot? Impoverished.
Taxpayer.
Subject.
Subject. Yeah. And I suppose there's also the how much do we want to arm our subjects?
Well, as I say, that's why you hire Greek mercenaries, because while they're working for you, they're not rebelling against you.
Yes, it is. I was really, because I mean, just thinking of Granicus, and there were some Greeks still in the Persian army after that. They stood and fought, didn't they?
I believe there were still Greeks fighting for the Persians at Arbela or Gaugamela. I mean, generally Greek mercenary hoplites were fairly reliable as long as you paid them.
Say that for an awful lot of mercenaries.
Yeah, well, true, most mercenaries. Yeah.
But to be fair to the Greeks, Macedonian or Persian, they were both barbarians. So, did it matter which side they fought?
Indeed.
Absolutely, indeed. Okay, right. Well, just moving on from that, I suppose maybe a question to everybody here is, who's used a hoplite, what you call a hoplite army, or an army that's got a decent number of hoplites in? It's not something I've particularly done. The nearest I've got is early Carthaginians.
I am guilty of that. I have used Kyrenian Greek, and I have also used mercenary Greek. Although, to be fair, the mercenary Greek was more Kyrenian Greek because it had 2 Kyrenian Greek allies. So,
Would serve exploiting an army list there?
No, not at all. Why would I possibly want whatever it was, 24 chariots on the table, along with hoplites? You'd never catch me doing that much. The Kyrenian Greek's an interesting one. Ignoring the dismantable farrago that goes with that list, I find hoplites quite an interesting. They're a great base for an army, but you need something else. Otherwise, it becomes tedious is the wrong word. It's not exactly an enlivening game. You walk forward and kill or be killed, basically. Kyrenian's quite interesting because it has a Macedonian ally, internal Macedonian troops, sorry, so it can have pikes, companion cavalry, and some reasonable light foot as well. So, it is what it is on the tin. If you take the traditional view of hoplites, you do literally just pick your point in the battlefield and walk forward. You use the pikes as your hammers, and the companions are there to exploit a hole. And you've also got 12 chariots as well, which are quite fun. Average javelins, short spear, I think, can be death chargers, but I don't think I use them as death chargers. I prefer them to run away, bravely run away. So
is this this an army where you've got some strike troops and the hoplites are a terrain feature with a spiky terrain feature?
It's a good description. Yes, they're the bit that everybody tries to avoid, and that just runs them into your sharp, pointy things on the flanks.
Yeah. My own experience with Greek hoplite armies is using them certainly out of competition in scenario games or friendly games. I've never had the courage or stupidity to try and use a traditional Greek hoplite army in competition. I've seen Spartans used on occasions in competition, where they tend to be very small but quite deadly.
Yes.
I once had a battle Gallic with fanatics against Spartans, and had my fanatic Soldori killed to a man by Spartan hoplites, which was a bit brutal, I seem to remember.
Yes.
Having the general killed at the same time as well. Yeah, but no, and I think that's the problem. I think in competition they are not particularly exciting, and up till now have been perhaps underperforming compared to other troop types.
Right. Why do you think that is? And will this naturally lead on to discussions of the spear category in the competition amendments?
Yeah, so I mean the hoplites, as we've had them in the lists up to now, have been in 6 or 8s and classified as long spear, shield, cover and shove. So they're not particularly cheap troop type, and you were needing to get 2 ranks to get combat factors. I think your average long spear, shield, cover, shove hoplite was in an army comprised of a lot of them, wasn't particularly seen to be a particularly good competition army. So,
sorry, just before you move on from that, I thought just a quick interjection, because I mentioned I'd used early Carthaginianism. Yes, I mean the I suppose spec I've used the few times I've used hoplite type troops. I suppose a bit like Matt was describing. They're quite good at occupying space, but you're not going to rely on them necessarily to win, other than those armies that use Spartans. Because I think didn't Matt McVeigh win a competition with the Spartan army, or certainly do very well in in the last year or so.
I think maybe I also remember Graham Clarker doing quite well with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, sorry, you were about to say about.
Anyway, so I think that leads us on to the 2026 competition amendment, where we have introduced a new weapon category for classical hoplites and Thureophori and similar. So the change now is that at impact, the spear in 2 or more ranks will get a +2 versus cavalry chariots and +1 versus others. And then in melee, if in 2 ranks, they will get +2 versus cavalry chariots and +1 versus others. But if in 1 rank, they will get +1 versus foot, except that will be cancelled by melee experts. So if the spear are fighting melee expert foot, they won't get the +1 in 1 rank. We've also changed it so spear will not cancel mounted impact claims. And 2+ deep spear will cancel mounted melee expert claims. That's probably more complicated than it sounds. The big difference being the 1 rank fighting versus foot other than melee expert, and the spear not cancelling mounted impact claims. The other change that's related to this is that supporting files fighting spear, so this is opponent with an overlap fighting the spear, will not downgrade the colour of the additional dice. So this is to encourage you to protect your flanks.
Indeed.
And along with that, spear will become 5 points a base cheaper.
And one other thing, the lists will now allow them to be 9s.
Indeed.
And yeah, I mean, I that's quite in some ways quite an important one. In my view, certainly one of the things that I think was an irritant, not a killer, but an irritant for spears before with long spear for the hoplite types, because I do recall that many of the medieval types could have 9s. Certainly your hoplites could only be an 8s. Was that linked with the needing 2 ranks to get the claims? Inevitably, that if you put them 3 wide, 2 ranks of 3, and then 2 2s, the file that lost a base was the one that was only 2 deep. So it always seemed to be that way. So just an irritant. Even if you had a spare base, you could move into it. You had to pay a cart to move it by allowing 9s. Now, obviously, against a lot of infantry, they can fight 1 deep now and get the +1 claim, but against melee expert, they still need 2. So I think the allowing 9s is actually quite a significant part of the package.
Yep, I would certainly agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of 1 rank except against melee expert was we didn't want them becoming too good against Roman legionaries. Also, you can argue that hoplites suffered a bit at the hands of later Thracians, who get melee expert from their Romphae, and also from Galatians, who of course are melee expert.
Yeah, I think we,
as well.
In some ways, I think those latter 2 are probably more important than the legionaries. They probably fought them more, or at least we have a count.
Fought them a bit more, but yes, I mean it's if you're looking at historical opponents of the Greeks, then primarily it is those 3 that are the melee expert troops, and that's where the sort of justification for the 1 rank rule came in. The not downgrading the supporting file, as I say, was primarily in there to encourage formations and protecting the flanks. And the 9s, I think, is a combination with the package of the 1 rank and so on. And it'll be, hopefully, we might see a bit more appearance of hoplites in competitions in the following year. But we will see.
Yeah, I think although might get mentioned in later on, I think it's worth noting that the non-downgrading of supporting files against spear also applies to long spear and pike as well. So there's a was an exception. Is there an exception for pikes with Kyle?
The downgrade rule applies to files fighting pike except keels, Kyles, long spear or spear. So yeah, I mean the 2026 amendments also change pike factors, and again the unit size, the UG size becomes 8s, 9s or 12s for pike, which again has a big impact because it will encourage broader formations of pike, because pike will now at impact get +2 if they are in 3 ranks.
It will, and the fact they can be fully effective in those wider formations means it's harder to slow them with shooting if they're deployed like that.
Indeed, yes.
As a terminal user of shooting armies, people deploying pikes too wide was brilliant. You have to do one something to slow them by 1 and 2 to slow them by 2.
Yes, and their alternative was to deploy 3 wide with 2 ranks and with 2 files of 3 ranks and 1 rank file of 2 ranks.
Yes,
which made them a bit more vulnerable.
Yeah, especially if they lost the base on the 2 rank one. You could somehow pick on that with troops. Yeah, Matt, what's your feelings on the proposed amendments around spear, especially?
Around spear, I'm quite keen. I always felt hoplites were a little too effective against cavalry for a troop type that didn't historically fight what I would call a lot of shock cavalry. And I think the changes are entirely sensible in the sense that it keeps everything feeling right, but just making them more vulnerable in a competition sense to the good quality cavalry that's out there, which I think is a plus. I also like the bigger unit sizes because again I think that's it adds to the resilience. I think from that point of view, cheaper points also helps. Positive all the way along, and I love the pike changes. I really do. I'm looking forward to seeing 12 block classical pike formations. I think that could have a particular fun to it.
I think it certainly changed the dynamic.
Yeah,
it's also it will add to resilience. Maybe not so much in melee type combat where you're probably fighting on the line, but again against shooting. Again, it can be quite easy to pick on an 8 base phalanx, 8 base pike unit, and knock a hole. I think it will become more difficult to do that, which is going to be annoying for me and the horse archers. But so it also means there's potentially fewer units, fewer UGs in some of these armies. So swings and roundabouts.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth stressing the list will now offer the options of 8s, 9s or 12s pike. So people who've got their units in 8s and wish to keep them in 8s are still able to do so. But I'm hopeful we'll see more 9s and 12s on the table.
Yeah, I have a little list of my, not that,
You
slightly
haven't-
longer than I thought it was, of my long spear and pike units in my armies, and what extra bases I do. And I've already had a bit of a dig in my spares box, and didn't really come. I've got some really irritating ones that don't quite work. You know, an extra base for my Edward IV pike block, 4 pikemen. I could have sworn
throwing a base of halberdiers or something.
those sort of things are springing to mind. There might be a few figures don't look necessarily quite like it. So, or I'll be asking Matt what he's got in STL files just to see do that. But yeah, no, I think that sort of, it really is a minor irritant, and you know, as you say, it making an 8 base unit to a 9 base unit, which is what that list will allow, a base of halberdiers wouldn't be a problem, wouldn't be out of place, and wouldn't be inappropriate. So, you know, it's not a problem. And I have filled some others with spares as well. Yeah, I'm going to be really interested to see what people do with this. And I think, like Matt as well, I think that hoplite type spears and a few others who are getting the spear categorization, like my Yamato Japanese, who I dobbed in it to you, with those troops not being, if you like, specialist anti-cavalry, will make the armies feel more historical, I think. You know, hoplites will still be good, especially in period. You know, they're close formation infantry, they're getting +2, and they cancel mounted melee expert if they're in 2 ranks. That's pretty contemporary cavalry proof from the front.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't make them an easy target for any cavalry, to be fair.
No.
Yes, it's not as if they suddenly, all of a sudden, are going to be ridden over by masses of cavalry. But hopefully they'll put up a bit more of an infantry fight as well.
Yeah, and you know, just back to the cavalry thing, if we look at what you said about Granicos, it seems that the most plausible historical account is the Macedonian phalanx attacked the spears frontally, and the cavalry went round the sides and back.
Yeah, it would be the way most wargamers would prefer to do it, I think.
Yes.
Rather than charging the companions frontally into the.
Yeah, and I think you still would do, especially because the companions have already done some fighting by then. So, in MeG terms, may have lost some bases, but if I remember rightly, the spears were on a hill as well. So.
Yeah,
Granicus or may have been on a hill. Yeah, so it's not as if you're going to look at them and go, "Oh, we'll just charge this cavalry into them and ride over them." Kiss you won't. Sorry, Matt. I think you were going to say something.
You literally said what I was going to say. So yeah, we were thinking along the same terms.
Yeah.
While we're on the subject, Matt mentioned the Kyrenian hoplites who were on their carts. So that brings up one of the other changes, which is worth mentioning. So dismountable as a characteristic for infantry is going to disappear. And various infantry will now have the mounted infantry characteristic. This completely gets rid of the rules that apply to dismountable for infantry. Those rules no longer apply. Instead, there will be 2 benefits for being mounted infantry. The first is that you can flank march a unit as if it were cavalry. Yes, you can send those four UGs of mounted infantry round the flank if you want to do so. But the second thing is they will scout as if they are skirmish foot. So mounted infantry will provide a little bit of a boost for scouting.
Right. I must admit I'd missed that, Richard.
Yeah. So if you've got 30 mounted infantry, that will equate to 1 scouting point. 1 scout. So the idea of doing that basically was to give mounted infantry some sort of benefit, even if you didn't flank march them. It's not a hugely expensive characteristic, but obviously the number of opportunities to flank march are pretty limited. It is also worth mentioning, I suppose, while we're talking about that, that the flank marching arrival system has tweaked slightly, so that instead of just needing red cards, when you determine flank march arrival, 2 yellow cards can be treated as the same as 1 red card. To take a simple example, if you are a mediocre general with, say, flank marching 2 units of skirmishing cavalry that would normally need only 1 red card, if you happen to draw 2 yellow cards in the same round, then the flank march would arrive. If you draw 1 yellow card, you've got an interesting choice. You can either discard it and hope to get a single red card, or you can hang on to it in the hope that you get a single yellow or a single red card from this 1 card you will be drawing. Now, I haven't actually gone through and worked out the odds on either of those. I suspect they're fairly similar. It's more useful as a feature when you get to flank marching with cavalry, and particularly if you've got a better general, because then you will have more options in terms of getting the flank march to arrive. That's an interesting change, which might make flank marches a bit more feasible in a few more circumstances. That's the hope anyway. I should also mention we're scrapping dummy flank marches because, quite frankly, they didn't do anything and were a bit of a waste of time.
I think, yes, I'd agree with that. But I suspect flank marching with a mediocre general is still going to be a bit risky.
Well, it's definitely it's about a there are six out of 50 is your chance on a single card, so you've got twice that basically. So you've got about a 1 in. It's not quite, but it's certainly at least a 1 in 5 chance of getting a red card from 2 cards, presuming that there aren't red cards being hoarded, of course. Which is one of those subtle effects of flank marching.
Actually, the 2 yellow option also makes hoarding red cards slightly less useful, doesn't it?
It does, and again was another perceived benefit of making this change.
Yeah, no, I think the 2 yellows equaling a red is a very good idea, because I had a game earlier this year against Will Denham, and he sent a flank march off that included some cavalry as well as flexible horse out of a horse archer army, and basically that they just didn't turn up.
Its chances of arrival are very slim. It's about a 1 in 3.
And he only had a competent general to send them with. It was
that's even worse. That's about 10, I believe.
Yeah, it didn't help that his on-table commands then got really rubbish cards, and I absolutely, I just could just manoeuvre to attack him in all sorts of horrible ways. But it was sort of he sort of chanced it, and okay, with the competent general, it was a risk, but it was too low a chance to make it realistically worthwhile
a talented general flank marching with cavalry now can have a reasonably good chance of getting onto the table fairly quickly.
Yeah, and if you do just flank march with flexibles, it might increase your chance of, or at least the option of, coming on as loose rather than skirmisher.
Indeed, yeah.
Which could make a difference as well. So yeah, no, I think that's I mean, there's positive change all around with the flank march, I think. So that's really good. Dennis, if you want to touch on any of the other proposed amendments at this point, Richard, I don't think we want to go through them all, but any you would like just to flag with people. As I mentioned that partly because they are still open for discussion. So,
indeed. Although if you are going to comment, please make it soon, because our intention is to have everything firmed up before Skull Rollers. That's always been the announced intention.
Just for the reference, Skull Rollers is the 25th and 26th of October.
Thank you, Nick. I wouldn't have remembered that.
Well, no. Also, we're recording this on the 1st, but it'll be a few days before they come out. So It's almost, you've got 2 weeks, folks.
Yeah. One I'll mention on the shooting is that we've tweaked the shooting so where it used to say you got a bonus if you were charged, we're now replacing that with when shooting at or less than 1 base width. That is a lot neater and avoids confusion in determining whether the claim or bonus account occurs. The other one, which I think drew some considerable comments is on shooting, is that we are changing the M13 rule, which is the fallback for other troops, so that only drilled may fall back, and they will require a red card, and that close or loose infantry with powerbow, bow, crossbow or sling will count an S as a wound when shooting at or below 1 base width. And this replaces the S that was a wound for crossbow standing to receive a charge. We've also tweaked the power bow, so they will only upgrade the colour when shooting at cavalry, camry or chariots at or less than 1 base width. So no machine gunning down cavalry at 5 base widths.
Yeah, I suppose in a lot of cases that equal to a 1 base width is likely to be if you're charged, but it does apply to more troops, which is interesting. I think it's going to be really interesting. So, and I'm sure some people will be able to, and some circumstances, especially with slowing, will occasionally leave some troops within 1 base width to be shot at.
Indeed, I think
so.
That's,
yeah. Am I right as well that equal to or 1 within 1 base width is going to apply to the additional cab for cannons?
It does indeed apply to the cab test for guns or cannons as well.
So again, that's all sort of neatened up, and everything is within or at 1 base width for those.
Yeah.
For those interactions. Yeah. No, I'm going to be really interested. I personally like the restricting fallback, because the fallback and shoot is really just not historical. And hopefully the additional casualties caused by the S equals wounds will improve the shooting effects as well too, which will so overall be interesting to see how that works out. Matt, your thoughts on that one? Or
similar? Actually, it's not the shooters stepping back that was always my problem. It was the mass lines of, I wouldn't call weak tribal troops, but people delaying contact with their large amounts of tribal troops because they want to focus on a different part of the battlefield. So you had, Gallic infantry just each taking a step back each turn in blocks, and that kind of irritates me more than archers doing it, to be perfectly honest. But either way, I think it's a good change. Whether the shooting balance will be quite right, that's what the testing's for, I guess. So to see if that evens up their survivability. But yeah, it was all good to me.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with the general step back thing. That's a good point, Matt. It's yeah, it's just a bit, and in a way, I like the fact that drilled are still doing it. 'Cause I've had a feeling for a while now that drilled infantry, especially, never quite felt to get all the benefit you'd expect, and this gives them something they can do that formed can't.
Certainly, my Janissaries may be coming out of the box again.
Oh, right. Yeah, so that feeling of yes, if you, especially perhaps in an army where you've got like the Janissaries, a unit or two that are drilled, you can do clever stuff with them that you can't do with the rest, and there could be sneaky things to do there.
And the other side effect I think we might see, theoretically speaking, is the increased use of skirmisher foot, because they can genuinely back off now. They are better at doing that kind of thing than any other archer in the game now. So we might see an improved use of those, which is all good to me, because I think they're a great troop type that people just don't use enough of.
Yeah, us flexible horse archer chaps really love them. Not. It's always sort of conspiracy against horse archers, I tell you. It's a good point, Matt. Actually, I hadn't really thought of that one. I have to confess. I think that's a really good point.
It's I was just thinking of the testing I'm doing. I suppose I haven't looked at the testing from that point of view. This is actually why testing amendments is quite challenging, actually, because you do come across unexpected consequences from testing these sort of amendments. So that'd be one. It'll be interesting to see, because I hadn't really thought about it in those sort of terms.
It will be, but I think you have to remember that SUGs can still just be pushed by tugs, and it is possible just to push them back behind other troops so they don't get to shoot. I think it could change the dynamic a bit, which is no bad thing. We've been playing the same dynamic for quite some time now in many ways. So a bit of a shake-up's always good every now and then. Not too often, but every now and then. It'd be interesting. I think this could be a classic case where some people might decide, oh, wow, I can suddenly, this is suddenly the best thing since sliced bread, and then find it isn't. or may just get a bit extra use out of the skirmishes. Let's face it, between the three of us, we've been saying for years that people don't use enough skirmishes. so there's a certain amount to be careful what you wish for, isn't there?
We will see.
We shall see.
The other thing I'll mention, because it's not a direct change, but is the alterations to the terrain table. Now, regular podcasters may remember that we talked about terrain about a year ago, was it now?
I think it's longer, actually. I think it might be a couple of years, Richard.
Time flies, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Anyway, so we've had a go at freshening up the terrain. And I'll do a summary of the changes. One of the significant ones is we've introduced a category which is called either dead ground if it's good going, a gully if it's rough going, or a gorge if it's difficult going. And these basically represent depressions. And the effect of this terrain will be that basically visibility from the edge of the terrain is restricted to 2 base widths, either looking in or looking out. So we've done away with any sort of combat claim for slopes, but it has the effect that to reduce the visibility if you're in the terrain and your opponent isn't, or vice versa, of course. If you're both in the terrain, there's no effect on visibility. So it's essentially when one side is in the terrain and the other isn't. And it'll be interesting to see what people make of that, and how it might affect things. We've slightly simplified the other forms of rough going. We've kept brush, but we've changed it so that it now provides cover for infantry SUGs. So rather than have a visibility rule, its brush is going to be a terrain type, which will again favour infantry SUGs. Not happy, I can see.
I'm going off these sets. I'm going off these changes. No, I like them.
The orchards and vineyards, which was rather a weird terrain type in the old rules, because you got cover if you were within it. So it became a very defensive shooting out from terrain type. We've replaced that and orchards with what we've called settlements. So these are described as organised and regular plantations of crops, vines or trees with boundaries and scattered buildings. They will restrict visibility for infantry to 4 base widths, and provide cover for any bases shot at when fully within, or any target shot at from or through the terrain. So the cover effect will work both ways.
That does seem to sort out the irritant with vineyards.
Yeah. We've also, town has been renamed as fort. And basically now I'll read it out. Boundary will be treated as barricades. Troops will be visible at 1 base width, if not at an edge of a fort. Cover for any bases shot at when fully within, or target shot at or from or through the terrain. Limited to a single piece, and may only be chosen by the defender. Must be touching defender's rear table edge, and may not be placed in the centre, so they're lost on a roll of a 3 or a 4. So they're a good defensive piece, but they are of limited capability in terms of where you can put them. So they don't become an automatic choice for the defender.
Sounds reasonable. It's fighting over towns isn't really a feature of ancient medieval warfare in the way it is in more modern warfare. Certainly in my view. Can I just mention a couple of other pre-battle changes, which I think are the ones I'd mention at this point. There's in the pre-battle sequence, in the event of a tie on territory types, the invader selects the territory type instead of the defender. And one which will impact, again, my armies undoubtedly, and a lot of other people, is that unused PBS cards cannot be kept for scouting, which I really like, although it does directly hit quite a lot of armies I use. It cuts out what I've always felt is a double bite at the cherry, especially for armies with a professional army commander and a lot of, say, flexible cavalry. You can easily carry 2 cards over to your scouting on top of maybe 5 or 6 you're getting, which is a lot.
I think it's a fantastic change. I know there are some that disagree with me, basically because when you work it out, a competent professional general with something like 11 light horse versus a legendary instinctive general with 11 light horse is still is equal PBSs. So it's 7 PBS and I think scouting of 3 for both of them. So the difference between a competent professional and a legendary instinctive is the same, and that never felt right. And also the vagaries of an infantry army with 2 cards but a PBS of 8 has a strong chance of getting a red, whereas a light horse army that only has 5 cards and a PBS of 6 or 7 is less likely to get a red. So the odds with the red being at 40% actually makes it quite hard for cavalry armies to out-scout professional infantry armies. And so I feel I think it works more in irregular generals now have a better, instinctive generals now have a better chance with high scouting points than they ever had previously. And I think that's much, from my point of view, much improved, although I do like my professional generals. I do like that. I really like that. The other thing I was going to say was the depressions gullies thing is also great from my point of view, because I have an interest in Mongolian history. And there is a lot of Mongolian accounts where they use depressions in the lines to hide cavalry maneuvers, which we couldn't do in MeG effectively. And now you get this kind of, particularly with a depression in good going, where suddenly you'll have a mob of cavalry suddenly appear out of one of these things. So
it certainly opens up scope for ambushes.
Yeah.
Having a good going terrain where you can hide troops in. It'll be interesting to see how that impacts the game.
Because from the Mongol point of view, if you have a depression in good going, a cavalry unit theoretically can come out of that in flex and be 10 base widths down the table before, and having already deployed 2 base widths away from the center edge, they can make a significant on-table flank march effectively, which you couldn't do under the previous set of terrain because there was nothing that you could ambush in that wasn't going to slow cavalry down, unless it was a hill, which was, unlikely to get in the. Anyway, so I like it. It's a. Oh, and the final thing I was going to say, the changes to elephants and their maneuvering in difficult going. Is that worth mentioning? Because I think that's quite, as we're on terrain.
It links to those settlement ones, the vineyard replacements, doesn't it?
Yeah, the elephant. There's none of the terrain now specifically is good going for elephants, which it used to be, but instead the elephant maximum movement distance in difficult going has been increased to 3 base widths. Now, bear in mind, in rough going, elephants are not affected by terrain in combat. So it's and while we're on elephants will be able to shoot at foot ranges, so they'll be able to shoot at 4 base widths. So
more picking on the poor horse archer. But again, it's right. They always should be. They always should have been.
Poor horse. Well, the poor horse archer was shooting at 3 anyway, and would have been in range.
Yes, but now they can shoot at you when you're not in range.
Well, now you've got to move them up closer. Yeah, it's not as if the elephants can fall back.
Elephants are tribal, so.
Yes, I think that hopefully will be a bit of an improvement. We also have a new special territory type of coastal dunes, which basically can be placed touching a deep water flank, and you don't have to make the dice roll, so there'll be no dice rolling for the sector. That coastal dunes, by the way, will count as difficult terrain for troops, including camels. But sand dunes is a specific territory type for desert, which only counts as rough going for camels, and sandy ground will be rough going that counts as good going for camels.
Okay.
So hopefully it will freshen up the terrain choices a bit, and we'll see how those play out.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. I mean, I don't know what. Well, I think I know what both of you are going to say on this. But I found the pre-battle has become really quite predictable and something you sort of just hurry through a bit nominally a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So freshening up in that area, from my point of view, has got to be good.
I certainly think the not being able to carry over the PBS cards may actually make more complex tables more likely with the terrain, depending on what your army flavor is. Because I mean, there was always the complaint that there was never enough terrain on the table for rough going armies and stuff. Now
Yes.
maybe this will swing it the other way slightly. It might not, but that's what testing's for. But
well, there's no incentive to sit on your yellow and red cards.
Yeah.
So you might as well use them in that 5-move shuffle around, or even to get the choice of territory type. So if you're picking if you choose your army to get a decent PBS score, because it's not going to affect your scouting anymore, people might be looking just to arrange it so with their general choice or whatever, so they get an extra PBS card for the terrain.
Yeah.
So I don't think it'd be a massive thing, but you might.
Sorry, go on.
I was about to say it might just give those armies that where you think you need a lot of terrain a bit more chance of getting it.
And and of course, professional generals still boost the scouting total.
Yes.
So I don't think it's going to badly affect. Certain people say, well, nobody will use professional generals. I don't think that's the case. It's still that extra scouting card actually becomes more valuable now.
In many ways, yes. Yes, it could do, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely. Again, back to like your horse archer armies. If your professional general gets you from 4 to 5 or 5 to 6, that'll actually be probably more useful now.
We mentioned elephants.
Oh.
And while we're on the changes, I think we should mention that a small change, but I think a significant one, is that cavalry, chariots and elephants will no longer claim the +4 for flank charges against other elephants. So
yes.
You still get it the +4 if you rear charge an elephant unit, but you can't now charge an elephant unit in the flank with cavalry and get that massive factor benefit that you previously did.
Well, there's a couple of games this year I wouldn't have won.
Funny enough, I was just thinking the same thing.
Saved by a flank charge of elephants with some cavalry that got round them. It's a
yeah.
I have no problem with that at all.
No, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Does an elephant care if a small bloke on a horse hits it in the side? Probably not.
Like I said, yeah, rear is still, because even if they don't have something for escorts, I think a lot of the elephants actually do have some escort capacity, and yeah, it feels okay. And it's a reward for actually getting troops all the way around the back of them.
Indeed.
So I suppose you could, if you really wanted, you could argue, well, if you get a bonus for the flank, why do you get one for the rear? But I think
yeah, and note that an infantry unit hitting an elephant unit in the flank will still get its charge bonus. So that's probably, in most circumstances, that's probably a dead elephant unit.
Yeah, it is. It's because I have charged cavalry into the rear of elephants this year, and that's equally pleasing. So just have to work a little bit harder to do that instead of just look for the flanks. It's all part of your planning, isn't it? I'm trying to exploit. Okay, well, I think we covered that, so we don't want to go through them all, but obviously do encourage people, if you do have any thoughts on it, please do comment in the forum. There's a topic separate topic for each of the changes. would say definitely ask if you don't like them. It isn't helpful just to say I don't like it. And actually, I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. I said that because actually, I think to date people have generally said I don't like it because X, Y, Z, and that's what you need on these things. Just I don't like it isn't very helpful. But if you don't like it because of a reason, please tell us. If you do like it, it's nice to know. It's nice to know.
And to be fair, we have changed quite a few of them since the initial draft was published as a result of feedback. So
yeah, it is very much a consultative process. Nearly tied my teeth up with that one. So there we are. Anyway, so yeah, please do. And as Richard said earlier, we're looking. The aim is to have them published before the Skull Rollers competition. Although they're not used at Skull Rollers, the aim is for people to use. They're available for use. Sorry, Richard, you can.
Yeah, I mean the purpose of publishing by the time of Skull Rollers is so by the time that 2026 competitions come around, people have had a chance to try them out in friendly games and or make adjustments to their armies, adding additional bases of figures, getting them printed out from STL files or whatever. And the army lists have been drafted with the corresponding changes. The draft army lists might still be tweaked slightly, but any existing army that is valid in the drafts as of October this year will still be valid come January. So I'm not going to make any changes to army lists that invalidates an army that isn't already valid in that is valid in the draft army lists as they are at the moment.
And again, I would encourage people to do that because it's great having some proofreading.
Yes, absolutely, because it's actually quite tricky to go through 625 army lists and spot all the things that need to be tweaked.
And that isn't just the changes because of the proposed amendments either. You might spot something that's been in there for 5 years. Yeah, especially happens if somebody suddenly looks at an army list and goes. So it's again those are it's a good thing if you can do that. I mean, obviously we do appreciate people generally look at the armies they've got. That's the ones you're interested in or the ones you're thinking about doing. But yeah, anything you do spot flag because it does help no end. Okie doke, folks. I think we've probably come to a natural conclusion on that. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, Richard.
I just will mention that I had an excellent time at the Society of Ancients convention last weekend. For those who aren't in the know, it's basically runs from Friday night through to Sunday afternoon. We ball game on Friday night typically. We have sessions both Saturday and Sunday morning and afternoon, which include a short presentation and basically gaming. And on Saturday evening, we have a guest speaker before dinner, who this year was Dr. Harry Sidebottom, that well-known fiction author, but also historian, who's recently published an excellent book on gladiators, and who gave a really entertaining talk on gladiators and all about the day and all the events that happened the day before a gladiatorial contest and 24 hours beforehand, as well as a lot of facts and myth busting on gladiators themselves.
Sounds good. Yes. I'll make one of them one day. I was tied down with family stuff last weekend, unfortunately. Well, actually not. Unfortunately, it was a very enjoyable family weekend.
Next year, the planned dates are in October, and we are, unfortunately, Missenden Abbey, where we held it this year, will be closing, but we are looking at transferring to Cranfield University. We are hopeful that we will be holding it there on the 17th to 19th of October 2026. So make sure you have no family events that and get your bookings in when they become available, which will be sometime next summer, I guess.
Okay. Matt, anything you want to mention?
Nothing that immediately comes to mind other than, there's a whole series of competitions coming up, which I'm sure you're about to cover.
I was just going to mention a few this year, yeah. So, yeah, well, off that prompt, I'll go. Okay, there's one the weekend after we're recording this, but that's a bit too soon, I suspect. That's Deventio at Boards and Swords Hobbies in Derby, but I suspect by the time we publish this, it'll either be running or will have run. After that, there's a couple more in October. 18th and 19th of October at Rouen in the suburb of Paris in France. I think it might still be possible to enter that. That's it's any army before 476 CE, I believe. I'm heading over there. I was there last year with Richard, had much fun, so I decided to go back, although Richard can't make it this year. So I will be braving the Paris Underground on my own with my nil French, unsupported by Richard, who could actually speak some French last year. So who knows where I'll end up, but hopefully I will end up at the competition. So I'm looking forward to that. But I said, obviously, like all of these details are on the forum. 25th, 26th of October in Daventry at Battlefield Hobbies. It's already mentioned. Skull Rollers 2025, which is open competition as is normal. These are all 15mm, 10,000 points, unless we say otherwise. Then 15th and 16th of November at Farnborough, there's Warfare, UK again. This is a sort of Western late medieval sort of competition, about 1350-ish, 1360-ish, till the end of whatever end dates there are for books in the Italian Wars PDF, so including those as well. Those are the only ones I know of that may still have spaces. Skull Rollers and Warfare definitely still have spaces, and possibly Rouen. There is a competition up in Stockport the very end of November, beginning of December, but I believe that is fully booked and there is already a waiting list on that one. But again, if you have a look on the forum, you could always drop the organisers a line to see what the state of play is. And that is a Crusades themed competition, where you have to pick to be either on the Christian or the Muslim side when you send your booking in. So I'm going to that one. I'm thoroughly looking forward to that. Love that period. I think it works really, really well in MEG, and we always have a great time in Stockport. So, and then after that, it's into 2026, and there are already a number of 2026 competitions on the continent and in the UK on the calendar. So, as I keep saying, check the forum out, get to see the dates for those. So that's the competition scene that I'm aware of. If I've missed anything out, apologies. But it probably means it's not on the forum. Always on the forum, please, folks. If you've got a competition, put it on there. We will pin it for you. So it'll be at the top in the bold section, and you can sort those in date order. So that's it from me on the competitions. I've got nothing else to say for once.
I would just like to thank you both for all the work you've put in on the forums on the amendments, because it's not a small task that you've taken on, and answering all the questions and dealing with the questions and the queries. So thank you.
I would say so. Richard's done most of the work on that because he's produced all the documents. And just to answer a question I did get asked by somebody, and just in case anybody else was going to ask the same questions, Richard's produced new QRS sheets for all the areas that have been changed or will be changed or part of the proposed amendments. So which includes the terrain stuff, the PBS stuff, as well as the combat and shooting tables, movement tables. So if you are going to be using the amendments, they're all on new sheets for you. So you won't have to try and remember what's on the forum or write it down on scraps of paper. And these will presumably, Richard, just be downloads from the website.
They will be. They are, and well, the draft ones are already available on the website, and the published ones will be, will be available to download from the website. And I'm hoping that anyone who attends Skull Rollers will get a set of QRSs for free.
There you are.
Wow.
Could be worth.
I love free stuff. Yeah, I love free stuff.
Free, my favorite price point. Yes. Said. Okay, so I think that wraps us up for that. So thank you obviously to Matt and Richard for this, especially Richard as ever for the topic.
Absolutely.
We might be forcing him to do something on pikes and such later, but we shall see. As ever, if you've got any suggestions for topics on the podcast, please send them in. I'm sure we'll do some more. Can't promise, as ever, can't promise when. Hopefully sooner rather than later. But on that, I will say thank you for listening and see you over the table, hopefully at some point, or just communication.
Yes. Remember, Richard and I are approachable. Nick, not so much. Always talk to us.
Thank you for reminding me, Matt.
You hadn't mentioned it in a while, so I thought I'd just prod the bear.
Okay. Thank you, and see you all soon.
Ta-ra all.
Cheerio.